I had always known that running a dairy farm alone would be hard, but I had inherited the property from my grandfather, and there was a stubborn part of me that refused to give it up. The land had been in my family for generations, and I had spent years learning the rhythms of the farm. The cows, the silos, the barns, the equipment, they were all familiar, comforting in their routine. But that night, everything felt off, like the quiet I had always known had been replaced with something heavy and uneasy. It was late summer, and the air hung thick with moisture. Fog had settled over the fields in the evening, blanketing everything in a gray haze that made it hard to see even a few feet ahead. I had spent the evening checking on the cows, making sure they were settled for the night. The milking machines were cleaned and stored, the feed bins were full, and the barn doors were all locked. Normally, I would have left the farmyard feeling accomplished, tired but content. That night, I was restless, thinking about the work left for the next day and the long hours that came with it. I was walking back toward the farmhouse after finishing the last barn when I heard it, the low, familiar growl of the tractor. My heart froze. I had locked everything up and made sure the keys were in my pocket. I never left the tractor running overnight. I froze in the fog, listening. The engine noise was deliberate, moving slowly, circling the barnyard, echoing against the walls of the old wooden barns. Each rotation made the sound deeper, heavier, like it was gaining strength as it came closer. My flashlight hung loosely in my hand, casting a thin beam through the haze, trembling with my grip. Instinct told me to run, but curiosity and disbelief rooted me to the spot. The engine noises grew louder, and I realized it wasn't moving randomly. It was circling in a pattern, like it knew the layout of the farm better than I did. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, and shone the flashlight toward the tractor. The moment the light hit the cab, the engine stopped. Silence returned, sudden and total. The only sound was the soft hum of the fog settling over the fields. I swallowed hard, stepping closer, my boots sinking into the damp mud. The cab was empty. I could see through the glass, the steering wheel and pedals in place, no one at all inside. I stepped even closer, reaching toward the door, and the wheel creaked slowly, turning as if an invisible hand was steering. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, but I couldn't look away. The steering wheel rotated, just enough to make my stomach twist. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the brake had loosened, maybe the gear shift had been left in neutral, but none of it made sense. I had checked everything before leaving, every time. Fear finally overpowered curiosity. I bolted toward the farmhouse, the flashlight bouncing in my hand, the mud sucking at my boots with every step. My chest burned with exertion, and my heart felt like it would tear itself free. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, ears straining for any sound outside. The farmhouse was old, drafty, and the walls seemed to amplify every tiny noise. The groan of the wind in the eaves, the creak of the old floorboards, the occasional thump from the barnyard, but none of it was the tractor. I checked my pocket. The keys were there. I had never touched the ignition again, never even looked at the controls after leaving the barn. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost meaning. I stayed in the kitchen, flashlight across the counter, listening to the quiet. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare. My grandfather had warned me about being alone on the farm, about the way silence could hide dangers you didn't understand. But he had never mentioned this. Eventually, dawn started to creep in, pale and colorless behind the fog. I knew I had to call someone. I reached for the phone and called the local constable. I tried to explain what had happened, my words tumbling out fast, shaking, incoherent at times. They said they would come as soon as they could, but it was rural, and help was never immediate. By the time the officers arrived, the fog had lifted slightly, leaving the farm drenched in wet, heavy air. They walked the grounds with me, carefully checking every barn, every shed, the feed silos, and finally the tractor. I led them to the spot where I had left it, and there it was, exactly where I had parked it the night before. The keys were in my pocket, the ignition off, the cab empty. There were no tire tracks in the mud, nothing to indicate movement. The officers looked at each other and nodded politely, murmuring that it must have been mechanical, maybe the engine had a fault, maybe the steering wheel had shifted in the night, though they admitted that nothing they could see explained the circling pattern. I wanted to shout at them, tell them that what I had experienced was real, but words felt useless against the impossibility of it. I spent the rest of the morning walking the property, checking everything with meticulous care. I went over the barns, the fields, the silage piles, every inch of the yard. Nothing seemed disturbed. The cows were calm, eating quietly, and even the barn cats were lounging in the sun like nothing had happened. The farm seemed to have returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the memory of the wheel turning, the engine growling in the fog. It was there in the back of my mind, persistent and heavy, a reminder that some things could happen without explanation, even on a place as familiar as my grandfather's farm. By mid-afternoon, I had gone through every routine twice, checking the locks, the keys, the machinery. The tractor worked perfectly when I tested it, no sign of the phantom motion from the night before. I started to feel a little relief, convincing myself that exhaustion, stress, and the fog had played tricks on me. I stayed awake that night too, but no sound came from the barnyard. I finally allowed myself to eat something and take a shower, the water hot and loud in contrast to the eerie quiet of the evening. In the days that followed, I checked the farm constantly. I installed a few extra locks on the barns and made sure nothing was left running. I even set up a small camera in the barnyard just to watch the fields while I worked inside. Nothing ever happened again. The engine never started by itself, the tractor never moved on its own, and the farmyard returned to its usual rhythm. But I couldn't forget that night. Every time I walked past the tractor or looked at the steering wheel, I remembered the sound of the engine cutting through the fog and the wheel turning as if it had a mind of its own. It wasn't ghostly or magical. It wasn't anything I could name. It was simply a moment of something inexplicable, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, strange things can happen. I stayed on the farm. I kept the routine. I kept the cows fed, the barns locked, and the fields tended. The tractor sat in its spot, quiet, reliable, and unassuming. But I never forgot the night it drove itself. I learned to live with the memory, a quiet caution about being alone, and about trusting the ordinary too much. The farm was mine now, but it held its secrets, and I had no choice but to respect them. In the end, everything was fine. The cows were healthy, the equipment worked, and the barns were secure. The tractor never moved on its own again, but the story of that night stayed with me, a small, unshakable truth in the rhythm of farm life. I was alone on the farm that evening, the kind of silence that only comes after a long day of harvesting. The air was thick with the smell of dry corn and soil, and the sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon. I had spent most of the day running the combine, hauling grain to the storage bins, and checking the equipment for any signs of wear before calling it a night. By the time I finished with the last trailer, my back ached, my boots were covered in dust, and the familiar wind had started to pick up, rattling the metal roofs and the corrugated sides of the barns. Everything felt quiet in the way that made a person uneasy, like the world had taken a deep breath and held it just for me. The silo always made me uneasy at night. It was one of the oldest on the property, a tall, cylindrical tower of corrugated metal that had been patched and repaired more times than I could count. The ladder leading to the top platform was narrow and rusty in some places, but I had climbed it dozens of times over the years. Tonight, I needed to check the grain levels. We had harvested more than usual, and I wanted to make sure the storage wasn't overfilled. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the ladder, the metal groaning under my weight. The wind whistled through the gaps in the siding, and I could feel the cold metal biting through my gloves. When I reached the platform, I shone the light across the top of the grain and froze. The surface wasn't smooth like I expected. There were footprints, clear, human-shaped impressions leading all the way to the platform. At first, I thought one of the other workers had climbed up while I was busy with the combine, maybe playing a prank. But the strange part was that the prints stopped at the platform. There were no prints leading back down. I swept the flashlight over the rest of the surface, hoping it was some trick of the light or the way the grain had shifted, but it wasn't. Someone had been up here, and they hadn't come back down the way they came. I called out. My voice echoed sharply inside the silo, bouncing off the metal walls in a way that made my stomach twist. "Hey, who's up there?" No answer. The only sound was the wind rattling the metal, and my own breathing, sharp in the stillness. I felt my heartbeat quicken, the kind of rapid pounding that made it hard to focus. I waited, thinking maybe someone would laugh or a voice would answer, and I'd shake my head at my own nerves. But there was nothing, just silence. Then it happened. I felt it before I saw it, a vibration through the metal ladder, almost like someone was stepping heavily beside me. The ladder was narrow. There was nowhere for anyone to stand, without me noticing. My skin went cold. I froze, holding onto the ladder tightly. I listened, straining to hear anything beyond the sound of the wind and my own breathing. But there was nothing. No shuffle, no shifting weight, no whisper of movement. Only the vibration that had passed as quickly as it came. I knew then that I wasn't imagining it. Something had been up there. Something had been near me. Panic hit, sharp and sudden. I scrambled down the ladder, one hand gripping the metal, the other holding my flashlight so tightly that it left red marks on my palm. My boots slipped against the rungs a few times, and I cursed under my breath, trying to keep my balance. Every step felt like a lifetime, and when I finally reached the ground, I didn't dare look up at the top platform. My chest was tight, my stomach twisting, and my hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble holding the flashlight straight. Finally, I forced myself to look. The beam of my flashlight cut through the night, and I saw it. A shadow, crouched at the top of the silo, in the exact spot where the footprints ended. It didn't move. It just watched me. The shape was human, but there was no detail I could make out. No face, no features, only the outline against the metal. I felt my throat tighten. I didn't wait to see if it would move again. I grabbed my truck keys from my pocket and ran, leaving the silo behind me, my boots thudding against the ground in the soft dirt. The wind tore past me, carrying a chill that made my back ache. I didn't look back, not once, until I reached the safety of my neighbor's porch. I explained nothing. I didn't need to. The relief of being among people, even just sitting in the warmth of someone else's house, was enough. I could still feel the weight of that presence, the way it had waited silently at the top of the silo watching. I didn't sleep that night, too keyed up, every shadow in the room making my heart skip a beat. The next day, I went back with daylight and a friend who had come to check on me. The silo was empty. Completely. No footprints, no disturbance in the grain beyond the normal patterns from harvesting. The wind had shifted the surface slightly, and any sign of that person, or whatever it had been, was gone. I searched around the perimeter, checking every corner of the farm, but there was no sign of anyone hiding, no broken fences, no fresh tracks in the dirt. It was as if the place had been empty the whole time. After that, I changed the way I worked. I never stayed alone on the farm after dark. Every time I had to check the equipment or move grain, I made sure someone was with me. I started double-checking the doors to the barns and silos, making sure nothing could be accessed without me noticing. I even installed motion lights and cameras near the silos, just in case. The first few nights, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the metal, every gust of wind made me jump. Weeks later, the farm felt normal again, but I never forgot that night. I still don't know who, or what, was up in the silo, and I don't pretend to. I have my theories, none of them comforting. But I do know one thing for certain. I will never be alone on this farm at night again. I learned to respect that silence, that feeling that someone could be watching, waiting. Some parts of the farm, some parts of the world, are not meant to be confronted alone. The rest of that season, I worked in pairs. I had neighbors check in more often, and I made a habit of locking the silos and barns whenever I left the property. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. I kept the lights on longer at night, kept my phone charged and close, and avoided climbing that ladder alone ever again. Even now, years later, I sometimes see that shadow in my mind, crouched at the top of the silo waiting. I never saw it move, never heard a voice or a footstep, but I felt its presence as surely as I feel my own heartbeat. And every time I pass the silo, even in the middle of the day, I pause for a second, just to make sure I'm not alone. Because whatever was up there that night knew exactly where I was, and it didn't need to follow me down. I never found out who it was, and I never wanted to. I told no one outside the farm, because people would call me crazy. But I learned a lesson that night about boundaries and respect, about the kind of vigilance that keeps you alive. The farm was mine, but I had to respect it and respect the unknown. I stayed, I worked, and I survived, but I never let myself forget that night, and I never let myself be alone in those fields again. I was staying at my uncle's farm in late August, the kind of heat that made the air hang heavy and thick with moisture, and the smell of wet earth and corn stalks so strong you could taste it. The cornfields stretched for acres around the old farmhouse, towering and green, some stalks bent over from the weight of the years. My uncle had been busy with the silage harvest, the process of chopping the corn and storing it to ferment for feed through the winter. The machinery groaned constantly, engines churning and belts whining like the farm itself was alive, and I spent the day helping as best as I could, carrying tools, checking gauges, and stacking bales. By the time night fell, my clothes were soaked with sweat and dirt, and my boots smelled of wet grass and manure. The sun set in a red haze that made the fields glow, and the cicadas sang their endless song. That night, sleep was restless. The kind of heat that lingers after dark made it hard to settle down, and the distant hum of the silage shredder still in the barn felt like a low, constant pulse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to check on the animals. The farmhouse was quiet, the lights dim, the only sound my own footsteps on the wooden floor. I slipped on my boots and grabbed a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in shaky circles. When I stepped outside, the air was cooler than I expected but still thick, and the farm smelled of wet earth and livestock. The cows were in the corral, restless, shifting their weight, their lowing different from the usual gentle hum. It was urgent, tense, almost panicked. They didn't seem frightened of anything I could see, but the way they moved and the way their eyes followed me made my stomach tighten. Something felt wrong. I walked toward the edge of the silage pit, the concrete walls slick with fermented corn and moisture. I wanted to make sure the machinery was off, the gears silent, and the hydraulic lifts at rest. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the shadows of the silage moving with the faint breeze, but no, there was definite motion. Slow, jerky movement, a dark shape that slid along the walls of the pit, dragging itself upward through the fermented corn. My first thought was some kind of animal had fallen in, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the way it moved, the size of it, didn't fit. It was awkward, almost human-like in its motion, but too long and spindly, and my brain refused to place it at first. I froze. My heart slammed in my chest, and my stomach went cold. The cows behind me went quiet, their lowing stopped, and I realized they were all staring at the pit too, their ears forward, tails stiff. The thing didn't move smoothly. It jerked like it had lost coordination or balance in the slick walls, and it rose higher, the tip of its shape just visible above the silage. My hands shook, and I wanted to step back, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Fear made me run. I didn't stop until I reached the house, adrenaline burning in my veins, boots slapping wet wooden boards. I grabbed my uncle, shaking him awake, and pointed toward the pit, but by the time we returned, the pit looked normal. No shape, no movement, just the broken corn stalks and the damp silage. I scanned every angle, shined the flashlight deep into the pit, but it was empty. My uncle muttered something about raccoons or a shadow, and went back to bed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind shift through the corn, the faint groan of machinery settling, and the restless lowing of the cows who refused to settle. They clustered along the edge of the pit, noses to the ground, eyes wide and unblinking, watching something invisible to me. The next day, the farm seemed normal in daylight. The corn still stood tall, the silage pit just a pit, and the machinery nothing more than machinery. I helped with chores, stacking bales and cleaning tools, but every time I glanced toward the pit, a shiver went through me. The cows were quieter during the day, but every time we passed the pit, they would shift uneasily, heads turning as if something unseen lingered in the corners. I avoided going near it as much as possible. That night, I tried to sleep in my uncle's old cabin, the one just past the barn. The air was cooler now, but the smell of wet earth and corn hung in the shadows of the room. Every sound outside, the distant squeak of a hinge, the low rumble of a tractor engine cooling, the occasional move from the barn, made me tense. I thought about the shape in the pit, the slow, jerky movements, and the way it seemed almost alive in a wrong way. I tried to convince myself it was an animal that had climbed out before I returned, but the motion had been too deliberate, too strange, and the pit was deep and slick. I couldn't explain it. Sleep eventually took me in short bursts, but I woke to the sound of cows again, this time near the barn, all lined up facing the pit, still and tense, heads low. I didn't need to look into the pit to know they were watching something. My uncle tried to reassure me, but I didn't need words. The behavior of the cows said it all. Something had been there, and maybe it was still there in some form I couldn't see. Over the next week, I stayed out of the pit's vicinity. We finished the silage harvest, the machinery moving in the daylight like nothing had ever happened. The cows returned to normal gradually, though I could swear they still hesitated near the pit. I spent my nights in the cabin, door locked, flashlight ready, not daring to approach the pit again. Eventually, I left the farm at the end of summer, the fields golden and ready for autumn, the machinery quiet and still. I never went near that silage pit again. My uncle never spoke about what I saw, and I didn't ask. He never mentioned it to anyone else either. But every time I think of that night, I remember the slow, jerky movements, the dark shape dragging itself up through the silage, and the way the cows had known it was there long before I saw it. I know now that farms can hold more than machinery and livestock. There are corners where things happen that no one can explain, moments when the earth and the air and the animals themselves seem to register something you cannot. That pit became one of those corners for me. Even years later, when I drive past a cornfield or see a silage pit, I feel the same tightening in my chest. I don't know what I saw that night, and maybe I never will. But I do know that the cows were right to be afraid. They sensed it before I did, and that's the only part of it that makes sense. You learn quickly on a farm that animals notice things humans cannot, and you trust them because they rarely lie. The pit has stayed in my mind ever since, a reminder that the world can have edges you're not ready for, and that some moments of terror are perfectly real without needing any explanation beyond what is visible to those who know how to watch. I had been looking forward to the trip to my friend's family farm for weeks. It wasn't far from the town I lived in, but it felt like stepping into a different world. Wide open fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with patches of trees and old structures that had clearly been standing for decades. The farm was well kept, but there was an undeniable weight to the older buildings, as if every weathered board and rusted hinge carried the memory of 100 years of work. I was staying in the small guest house near the edge of the property, a single-story building with peeling paint and creaking floors that smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. It was close to an old barn that hadn't been used for as long as anyone could remember, and my friend's father always joked about leaving it locked because it was full of broken tools and debris. I never thought much of it until that night. The day had been hot and sticky. Summer in that part of the country always brought heavy, thick air that seemed to cling to your skin. Cicadas droned constantly, their shrill buzz filling the long stretches of the fields. I spent the afternoon wandering a little, watching the cows and chickens, helping a bit with small chores, though mostly I stayed out of the way. By evening, I had settled into the guest house, grateful for the slight breeze that passed through the screen windows. The sky had turned a deep orange, streaked with purple, and the sun sank slowly behind the far edge of the fields. It was quiet in that typical farm way, quiet in the background, but full of tiny noises if you paid attention. The low moan of cattle, the distant hum of a tractor that had long since stopped, and the steady rustle of leaves in the warm wind. I went to bed earlier than I normally would, mostly because the heat had drained me. I had a thin sheet over me, and the window cracked open to let in the nighttime air. The cicadas continued their song, loud and unrelenting. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke. I wasn't sure why at first, maybe the sweat on my back, maybe just a shift in the wind. Then I heard it, a slow, creaking sound, rhythmic, almost like the hinges of a door being pushed and pulled, squeaking under weight. My stomach sank. I had been told the barn was locked and empty, that nothing had been in there for years. I held still, straining my ears. The creaking continued, low and uneven. It wasn't loud enough to wake anyone else in the main house, but close enough to make my heart race. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and approached the window. The moon had broken through some clouds, casting a pale light over the fields, and I could see the barn clearly from the guest house. Its paint was cracked, wood warped in places, and the big sliding doors were supposed to be locked tight. I could see one of them slightly ajar, moving, though there was no wind strong enough to push it that much. I leaned closer, my chest tight. That's when I saw it, a figure moving inside the barn. It was tall, unnaturally so, and hunched over. It seemed to be dragging something across the floor. I couldn't tell what it was, only that it made a low scraping sound against the wooden planks. I froze, my mouth dry, afraid to even breathe. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure moved slowly, methodically, like it knew the barn as well as it knew its own body. Shadows stretched across the walls, thrown by the moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the wood, making the person look distorted, almost monstrous. I reached for my phone to call someone, anything, but the screen told me there was no signal. None at all. That made sense, I thought, considering how far out this farm was, but it did nothing to calm the rising panic. I weighed my options, my mind racing. I could hide in the guest house, wait until dawn, and hope that whatever it was left. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I decided I had to see for myself what was happening. I had to know what had moved into that barn after all these years. I pushed the guest house door open slowly, careful not to make a sound. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I held my breath each time. The wind had picked up slightly, and the cicadas' song seemed distant now, replaced by the low creaks and groans of the old wood around me. I moved toward the barn, keeping to the shadows of the fields. As I approached, I saw that the large sliding doors were slightly open. I could just make out the interior, stale, dark, the smell of old hay and dust thick even from the doorway. The barn looked empty at first, no sign of movement. I called out softly, my voice breaking slightly, but no answer came. Only the soft whisper of the wind. I stepped inside, the boards under my feet trembling with each step. Then I noticed the scratches. Long, deep marks etched into the walls near the entrance. They weren't there before, I was certain of it, because I had walked past the barn earlier in the day and noticed every crack and crevice. Now there was a trail of fresh hay on the floor, leading from the side of the barn toward the open doors in the back that led to the field. The trail was uneven, clumped in places, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor. I followed it cautiously, my chest hammering. The barn smelled stronger now, musty, but with something sharp beneath it, almost like iron. By the time I stepped out into the open field, the trail stopped abruptly. There was nothing to be seen, only the long grass swaying in the moonlight, the trees at the edge of the field motionless. My pulse was racing. I checked the barn again, peering through the doorway. Everything inside was still and silent. The figure had vanished. I walked back to the guest house slowly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. My mind ran through explanations. Maybe a farmer had come from somewhere to retrieve equipment. Maybe a neighbor had left a gate open, and something had wandered in. But nothing fit. There hadn't been any mention of people coming to the farm that night. My friend's family was asleep, the farm was quiet, and the doors were supposed to be locked. Morning came with its usual calm. Birds chirping, a breeze moving across the fields, the sun spilling golden light into the guest house. I walked back to the barn in daylight, expecting to see nothing unusual. The hay trail had dried slightly in the night, the scratches on the wall obvious in the sun. I took photos with my phone, hoping to show my friend's father. When I told him about it, he walked with me slowly around the barn, examining the scratches and the hay trail. He shook his head, his face pale, insisting that no one had been there for decades. That barn had been sealed since before he was a teenager, and nobody had the keys. I never did find a concrete explanation. The scratches were real, the hay trail real, and whatever had been inside that night had left without a trace. I spent the rest of my visit on edge, constantly checking the doors, listening to every sound, and watching the fields as shadows shifted in the wind. I told myself it must have been some trespasser, maybe someone hiding or using the barn for reasons unknown. But the thought that someone could move through that space, unseen and unchallenged, and disappear before anyone knew they were there, stayed with me long after I left the farm. Even now, years later, whenever I drive past a field at night and see the silhouette of an old barn, I feel the same tight pull in my chest, the same instinct to hold my breath and watch for movement. I don't know who, or what, was in that barn that night. I only know that it was real, that I saw it, and that the memory of it has stayed with me, impossible to shake. The scratches, the hay trail, the figure hunched over dragging something. It is all as clear in my mind now as it was then. I cannot explain it. I can only remember and wonder, and I have no desire to ever be that close to that old barn again. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of my dog barking, a sharp, urgent noise that pulled me out of a deep, dreamless sleep. The room was dark, the small lamp on the bedside table unlit, and the air felt unusually cold, even though I had left the heat on. At first, I thought maybe he had just heard a raccoon or a stray fox, something that sometimes wandered through the yard, but the barking was different this time, more frantic, almost desperate. My dog, a large black lab, rarely barked at anything for long, and he didn't run off to the corners of the yard. This time, he was pacing at the far end of the barn, growling low, his hackles raised. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake anyone else, even though the house was empty. The hardwood floor creaked under my bare feet as I moved toward the barn, the sound strangely loud in the quiet night. I grabbed my flashlight from the counter in the kitchen, the one I kept fully charged for emergencies. Its battery had been fine this morning, but I still checked it, clicking it on and off, watching the beam cut through the darkness. My dog's barking grew louder as I approached the chicken coop, a low, continuous growl mixed in, something I hadn't heard from him before. The coop door was latched, as it always was. I never left it open at night, not even for a few minutes. The latch was tight, and the door had been closed all day. My dog jumped against the side of the coop, barking as if trying to tell me something. I hesitated for a second, then released the latch and slowly pushed the door open. The smell hit me immediately, a metallic tang mixed with something earthy, something that didn't belong. Inside, the scene was worse than I could have imagined. The chickens were scattered across the floor, their bodies unnaturally clean. No feathers were out of place, no sign of struggle beyond the sudden lifelessness of the animals. My flashlight beam moved over the bodies, and I noticed that their eyes stared blankly, almost accusingly, into the dim light. My stomach turned. I had dealt with predators before. A raccoon or a coyote sometimes got through, but never like this. Never all at once, and never so precise. My attention was drawn to the far corner of the coop. There in the dirt floor were deep claw marks, wide and jagged, dug into the ground like something had been digging furiously. The marks led right up to the wall and then disappeared. They were fresh, the soil still loose, and the pattern didn't match any animal I knew. My dog backed up, growling low, his eyes fixed on the corner, refusing to move any closer. Then I heard it, breathing. Slow, deliberate, almost exaggerated. I spun around, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The barn was empty, silent except for my own rapid heartbeat and my dog's low growl. I turned back to the corner, and I swear I saw movement, a shadow that didn't belong, crouched low against the wall. It blended with the darkness so well that I could barely make it out, but the shape was unmistakable, small, quick, almost animal-like, but not. I couldn't tell if it was alive, or if it was just the shadow playing tricks on my mind. I backed out slowly, trying not to turn my back completely. My dog followed, still growling, hackles raised. The air felt heavy, thick, almost sticky, as if the night itself was holding me down. I could hear the faint rustle of straw in the corner, as if something was moving just out of reach. My hands shook as I clicked the flashlight off and on, trying to illuminate the corner, but every time I looked, it seemed farther away, like it had melted into the shadows. I left the coop, my dog pressed close to me, and I didn't look back. The cool night air outside felt like a relief, the fog settling over the fields giving the place a quiet, eerie calm. I walked around the yard, checking the perimeter, making sure nothing else had been touched. The cornfield to the east was dark, the tall stalks swaying gently in the breeze. I scanned the tree-line, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of movement, no footprints other than my own. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I had spent hours pacing the yard, unable to sleep, unable to shake the image of those claw marks and the feeling of being watched. I went back to the coop in the daylight, expecting to see the same scene, expecting to find evidence, but it was gone. The bodies were gone, the dirt smooth, the floor clean, as if nothing had happened. My dog sniffed around the coop, confused, nudging at the ground with his nose. He seemed calmer now, but still wary, glancing over his shoulder constantly. I searched the surrounding fields and barns, but there were no tracks, no signs of a predator. Nothing to explain the sudden, precise slaughter of the chickens or the claw marks in the dirt. I inspected the fence lines, the gaps in the gate, the surrounding woods, but everything was as it should be. The quiet of the morning felt deceptive, almost mocking, after the terror of the night. I decided to take extra precautions after that. I reinforced the chicken coop, added stronger locks, checked the perimeter every night, and even installed motion-activated lights around the yard. The chickens stayed safe, for the most part, though a few were always uneasy, pecking nervously at the dirt and glancing toward the corners of the coop. My dog never barked at night again, never showed the same fear, but I could tell he remembered. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he moved, always alert, always cautious. It wasn't long before I understood one thing clearly. Whatever had been in that coop that night was fast, smart, and precise. It didn't leave tracks because it knew how to move. It didn't leave bodies behind because it took what it needed. It didn't want to be caught, and it wasn't something I could fight off with a flashlight or a baseball bat. From that night on, I never went into the coop alone after dark. I never tried to confront the shadow in the corner or understand what it was. I learned to accept that some things exist in the world that you can't explain, that operate by rules you can't anticipate. The farm went back to its usual rhythm, the crops grew, the chickens multiplied, and life seemed normal again. But I always felt the memory of that night, the image of those deep claw marks, the sensation of being watched, like a shadow just beyond the corner of my vision. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees and the night was still, I could swear I heard something moving softly in the distance, just at the edge of the yard, reminding me that whatever it was still out there, watching, patient, and waiting. Life on the farm continued, but the lesson was clear. Some nights are not meant to be faced alone, and some shadows are better left unexplored.